The frozen moon Valaxis forehung at the edge of Alliance space like a forgotten pearl in the vast darkness. Its surface was a testament to nature's cruelty, where temperatures plummeted to negative 200 degrees Celsius during the endless night cycles, and winds carved sculptures from ice that could shatter diamond. Grant Sorrell had chosen this exile deliberately, seeking a punishment that matched what he believed were his crimes. The former Special Operations Commander of Earth had arrived here 15 years ago, carrying nothing but his guilt and a determination to disappear from the universe that still whispered his name in horror. The Climate Research Station, abandoned by its original scientists who deemed the moon too hostile even for machines, became his monastery of penance. Grant had rebuilt its systems with his own hands, coaxing life from frozen circuits, creating warmth where nature permitted none. His days followed rigid patterns now. Wake before the pale sun touched the horizon. Check the heating systems he had jury-rigged from salvage parts. Record atmospheric data that no one would ever read. Repair the endless damage wrought by storms that could strip metal from hulls. Sleep when exhaustion finally overcame the nightmares. This was his chosen existence, a man reduced to basic survival, stripped of everything that once made him Commander Sorrell. The station's main chamber held remnants of his former life, though he rarely acknowledged them. His combat medals lay in a drawer, untouched since the day he threw them there. The commendation from the Galactic Council, praising his decisive action in neutralizing the Kepler-7 terrorist threat, hung face down on the wall. What the commendation didn't mention were the 300 civilian casualties, the families vaporized because his intelligence had been wrong, because he had given the order to fire. Outside, Valaxis 4's landscape stretched in monochrome brutality. Mountains of compressed ice rose like tombstones, their surfaces polished to mirror smoothness by centuries of particle storms. The research station nestled in a canyon that provided minimal shelter, its reinforced walls bearing scars from countless impacts. Grant had added his own modifications over the years, installing redundant power systems, reinforcing weak points, creating a fortress of solitude that could withstand anything the moon threw at him. His only companions were the maintenance robots he had reprogrammed, giving them personalities to stave off madness. Unit 7 he called Shakespeare, for its tendency to quote ancient Earth literature while performing repairs. Unit 12 was Mozart, humming classical compositions as it monitored life support. They were poor substitutes for human contact, but Grant had forfeited his right to companionship the day those civilians died. The weight of isolation pressed heavier with each passing year. Sometimes Grant would stand at the observation port, watching the storms rage across the frozen plains, and wonder if this was what death felt like, stretched across decades instead of moments. He had come here to die slowly, to fade from existence as penance for lives he had taken. The universe seemed content to grant his wish. On this particular night, as Grant performed his evening rounds, checking seals and systems with methodical precision, the station's proximity alarms erupted in cascading warnings. His hands moved instinctively to weapons he no longer carried, muscle memory from a life he had abandoned. The tactical display showed movement in the storm, large signatures approaching through conditions that should have been lethal to any living thing. Grant activated the defensive systems he had never expected to use. Automated sentries came online, their targeting systems struggling to lock onto shapes that seemed to phase in and out of the sensor grid. His heart rate elevated for the first time in months as he watched the signatures draw closer. Were they raiders? Scavengers? Had someone finally come to bring him the death he simultaneously craved and feared? The main entrance sensors detected impact, not the explosive breach of an attack, but something else entirely. A sound filtered through the reinforced walls, barely audible over the howling wind. It was not mechanical, not the screech of metal or the hiss of cutting torches. This sound carried a quality that made Grant's chest tighten, a mournful note that spoke of suffering. Against every instinct honed by decades of combat, Grant approached the entrance. The security feed showed shapes in the storm, massive forms huddled against the outer wall. As his eyes adjusted to the static-filled image, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The creatures were enormous, easily 3 times his height, their bodies covered in what appeared to be scales beneath layers of accumulated ice. They were not attacking. They were not even trying to breach the entrance. They were simply there pressed against the only source of warmth for 1,000 kilometers in any direction. Grant enhanced the image, his breath catching as details emerged. The creatures resembled dragons from ancient Earth mythology, though these were clearly not products of human imagination. Their scales were visible beneath the ice, shimmered with an internal light that pulsed weakly, like dying stars. Their wings, folded tight against their bodies, showed tears and damage from the storm. But it was their eyes that struck him most forcefully, eyes that held intelligence, that looked directly into the camera with an emotion he recognized all too well. Desperation. One of the creatures raised its head, ice cascading from its form, and produced a sound that the station's computers immediately began analyzing. Not random noise, but structure vibrations, patterns that suggested language. The creature repeated the sound, and Grant watched in amazement as condensation from its breath formed symbols on the entrance port, crude but deliberate markings that his translation software identified as mathematical constants. They were trying to communicate. These beings, these dragon-like entities that by all rights should have been mindless predators or territorial beasts, were attempting to establish meaningful contact. Grant's hand hovered over the entrance controls, decades of training screaming warnings about unknown species, about the dangers of first contact protocols, about the 1,000 ways this could end in disaster. Another sound reached him, different from the first. Weaker, more plaintive. The cameras showed one of the creatures had collapsed, its body shuddering with what could only be the final stages of hypothermia. The others pressed closer, trying to share what little warmth they possessed, but Grant could see it was futile. Without intervention, these beings would die at his doorstep. The moment crystallized around him, a decision point that would define whatever remained of his life. He could maintain his isolation, let nature take its course, remain the ghost he had chosen to become. Or he could open the door, violate a dozen regulations about unauthorized contact, and possibly save lives that were fading before his eyes. Grant's fingers moved across the controls, overriding safety protocols, disabling automated defenses. As the outer door began its opening sequence, he spoke into the empty air, his voice rough from disuse. I spent my life taking lives. Maybe it's time I save some instead. The massive doors ground open, revealing the full magnitude of the storm and the creatures huddled within it. They made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of predatory intent. Instead, the two still standing carefully lifted their fallen companion, their movements deliberate and gentle despite their obvious weakness. When Grant stepped back, gesturing to the airlock's interior, they understood immediately. As the dragon-like beings entered his sanctuary, ice falling from their forms in sheets, Grant realized his 15 years of self-imposed exile had just ended. Whatever these creatures were, whatever they needed, they had found perhaps the only human in the galaxy desperate enough for redemption to help them without question. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony after all. The environmental systems screamed protests as they tried to accommodate the 3 massive forms now crowded in the airlock. Grant's fingers flew over controls, routing emergency power to the heating units, watching as the temperature differential created clouds of vapor that obscured the cameras. Through the mist, he could see the creatures arranging themselves carefully, their intelligence evident in how they positioned their injured companion nearest to the heat source. When the inner door finally opened, Grant got his first unobstructed look at his unexpected guests. They were magnificent and terrible in equal measure, beings that seemed sculpted from nightmares and dreams. Their scales, now visible as the ice melted away, shifted through colors he had no names for, patterns that hurt to look at directly. But beneath the alien beauty, he saw damage that made his soldier's mind calculate survival odds. The scales were cracked in dozens of places, showing raw flesh beneath that wept a fluid the color of mercury. Their wings, when one tried to extend them slightly, revealed tears that would make flight impossible. These were not creatures in their prime, but survivors of something catastrophic, refugees from a disaster he could not begin to imagine. Grant approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, speaking in the calm tone he had once used with wounded soldiers. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here." He knew they couldn't understand his words, but tone and intent often transcended language barriers. The largest of the three, the one who had drawn symbols on the door, tilted its head in a gesture so bird-like it was almost familiar. From deep in its throat came sounds that the station's computers continued to analyze, finding patterns within patterns, structure that suggested not just language but complex communication. Moving carefully, Grant retrieved emergency medical supplies, though he had no idea if human medicine would help or harm these beings. He held up a thermal blanket, demonstrating its purpose by wrapping a corner around his own arm. The creature's eyes tracked the movement, and after a moment's hesitation, it reached out with a limb that ended in digits far too graceful for its size. The touch, when it came, sent shock through Grant's system. Not physical shock, but something deeper, a sensation like memories that weren't his own flickering at the edges of consciousness. Images of vast spaces, of skies filled with auroras that sang, of a cold so profound it had its own beauty. He jerked back instinctively, and the creature made a sound that might have been an apology. They worked in careful concert then, Grant providing what aid he could while maintaining a respectful distance. The thermal blankets, designed for human physiology, seemed to provide some relief. He offered water, which they accepted with evident gratitude, though they consumed it in a way he had never seen, seeming to absorb it through specialized organs in their throats. As the immediate crisis passed, as warmth began to penetrate their frozen forms, the creature's behavior shifted. They arranged themselves in what was clearly a defensive formation around their injured companion, but their attention remained fixed on Grant. One of them, smaller than the others with scales that held more blue than purple, began to produce object from a pouch integrated into its body. The items were clearly technological, though their design followed no principles Grant recognized. Crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light, materials that seemed to exist in states between solid and liquid. The blue-scaled one arranged these objects in a careful pattern on the floor, and suddenly the air filled with holographic images. Grant found himself looking at a world of ice and crystal, where structures that defied architectural logic rose from frozen seas. The images showed thousands of the dragon-like beings in what was clearly a thriving civilization. But as the display continued, the tone shifted. The aurora in their skies began to dim, the ice cities cracked and fell. The final images showed exodus, streams of beings fleeing into the dark between stars. "Your world," Grant said softly, understanding flooding through him. "Something happened to your world." The largest creature moved then, its movements careful despite its size. It approached one of the wall displays, showing external temperature readings from around Valaxis 4. With one digit, it traced the downward progression of numbers, then gestured to the holographic display of their dying world. The parallel was unmistakable. These beings hadn't come here by choice. They were refugees from a climate catastrophe, and somehow they had known or sensed that this research station, this tiny bubble of warmth in a frozen hell, might offer sanctuary. But there was more to it, Grant realized. They weren't just seeking shelter. They were trying to tell him something. The blue-scaled one manipulated its crystal devices, and new images appeared. Technical diagrams that made Grant's head spin, showing energy patterns and orbital mechanics. Slowly, with patience born of desperation, they began to build a bridge of understanding. Mathematics became the common language, constants and equations that transcended species. What emerged was a picture of catastrophe on an interstellar scale. Their home system star had begun an unexpected phase transition, its output dropping by fractions of a percent each year. For a world already balanced on the edge of an ice age, it was a death sentence counted in decades rather than millennia. They had fled in generation ships, seeking any world that might offer refuge, but the cold had followed them like a curse. Grant found himself drawn into their explanation, his scientific training reawakening after years of dormancy. He pulled up the station's archive data, showing them 15 years of climate observations from Valaxis 4. The patterns were there, buried in the numbers he had collected out of habit rather than purpose. The moon's already harsh climate was deteriorating, its distance from the system's star combining with orbital decay to create a feedback loop of freezing. But the dragons had not come seeking salvation from him. They had come with a proposal, a possibility that required someone with access to technology they could not operate themselves. They began to show him more diagrams, these depicting satellite networks and orbital installations that Grant recognized all too well. The Halcyon Network, climate control satellites placed in orbit during the terraforming era, now decommissioned and forbidden by treaties that prioritized non-interference over survival. The dragons had somehow learned of these satellites, had calculated that reactivating them could stabilize not just Valaxis 4, but create a chain reaction that might save their temporary colonies throughout the system. Grant felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He knew those satellites, had studied them during his military career. They were weapons as much as tools, capable of redirecting solar energy in ways that could nurture or destroy. The treaties banning their use had been written in blood after the weather wars of the previous century. "You're asking me to break the law," he said, knowing they understood tone, if not words. "To violate treaties that keep the peace." The largest dragon moved again, this time to the corner where Grant's service medals lay forgotten. With surprising delicacy, it lifted one of the decorations, studying the symbols of valor and sacrifice. Then it placed the medal carefully back in its box and turned to Grant with eyes that held too much understanding. They knew what he was. Not just a hermit hiding from the universe, but a soldier in exile, someone who had made terrible choices and lived with the consequences. And they were asking him to choose again, to weigh the certainty of law against the possibility of redemption. The injured dragon stirred then, raising its head with obvious effort. Despite its condition, it began to sing, for there was no other word for the sounds that emerged. Notes that resonated in frequencies Grant felt in his bones, melodies that spoke of loss and hope intertwined. The others joined in, their harmony creating something that transcended mere music. As their song filled the station, the crystalline devices responded, projecting new images. Not technical diagrams this time, but memories. Young dragons learning to fly in aurora-painted skies. Families gathered in ceremonies Grant could not comprehend but recognized as sacred. Art and science and philosophy rendered in forms both alien and achingly familiar. They were showing him who they were beyond the desperate refugees at his door. A people, a culture, a species that had looked at the stars and wondered, just as humanity had. They had built and dreamed and loved, and now they faced extinction not through war or plague, but through the cruel mathematics of orbital mechanics and stellar evolution. Grant sank into his chair, the weight of decision threatening to crush him. 15 years ago, he had given an order that killed innocents because he believed it would save lives. The mathematics had been wrong then, the intelligence flawed, the outcome catastrophic. Now he faced another calculation, another choice between certain law and uncertain justice. His hand moved to the communications console, fingers hovering over controls that could connect him to the orbital network. The dragons fell silent, watching, waiting. They had made their case not with threats or demands, but with shared humanity, even across the vast gulf between species. "The satellites have been dormant for 50 years, Grant said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Their controls are encrypted, their systems locked by every security protocol the Alliance could devise. Even if I wanted to help, even if I could justify breaking those laws, I don't have the access codes." The blue-scaled dragon chirped, a sound almost like laughter. It manipulated its crystals again, and Grant watched in amazement as holographic displays showed the satellite network in perfect detail. Technical specifications scrolled past, including security protocols that should have been classified beyond any civilian access. They had done their homework, these refugees from a dying world. Somehow, through means Grant could not fathom, they had acquired information that should have been impossible to obtain. And now he understood the full scope of their visit. They didn't need him to break the encryption. They had already solved that problem. What they needed was something far simpler and far more complex. They needed a human. The satellites were biometrically locked, designed to respond only to human operators as a safeguard against exactly this sort of scenario. All the knowledge and technology the Dragons possessed meant nothing without a human hand to initialize the system, a human voice to speak the activation commands, a human will to take responsibility for the consequences. Grant rose from his chair, moving to the observation port where Valaxis 4's frozen landscape stretched to the horizon. Somewhere out there, he knew, were more of these beings, huddled in whatever shelter they had found, slowly freezing to death while they waited for an answer to their desperate gambit. He thought of the families on Kepler 7, the civilians who had died because he had made a choice based on incomplete information and absolute certainty. He thought of 15 years spent in self-imposed exile, accomplishing nothing but his own slow dissolution. He thought of laws written by comfortable bureaucrats in warm offices and treaties that valued principle over life. When he turned back to the Dragons, his decision was made. Show me everything. Every calculation, every projection, every possible outcome. If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to risk starting another weather war, I need to know exactly what we're trying to accomplish. The next hours passed in a blur of technical data and complex mathematics. The Dragons' grasp of the science involved was staggering, their projections detailed down to fractional percentages. They showed him how reactivating specific satellites could create a cascade effect, using Valaxis 4's unique position to influence weather patterns throughout the system. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, surgical in its precision. No grand gestures or planetary-scale engineering. Just careful adjustments to existing systems, nudging the climate away from its death spiral and towards something sustainable. The risk of weaponization was minimal. The protocols they had developed, including safeguards that would prevent military applications. As dawn broke over Valaxis 4's frozen landscape, Grant found himself convinced not by the technical arguments, but by something far more fundamental. These beings had crossed interstellar space, had acquired impossible knowledge, had thrown themselves on the mercy of a species they had every reason to fear, all for the chance to save their kind from extinction. The communication array came online with a sound like singing crystal. Grant input his military identification codes, remnants of a career he had tried to forget. The system recognized him, welcomed him back with electronic indifference. His authorization, never formally revoked despite his exile, still carried weight in the automated protocols. The Dragons arranged themselves around him, their crystal devices integrating seamlessly with the station's primitive technology. Together, they began the delicate process of awakening machines that had slept for half a century. Satellite by satellite, the Halcyon network stirred to life. Warning messages cascaded across the displays. Treaty violations, unauthorized access, automatic alerts that would soon reach Alliance Command. Grant acknowledged each one, adding his biometric confirmation to every override. If this failed, if he had miscalculated again, there would be no exile this time. Only trial and execution for crimes against the peace. The first satellite responded, its ancient systems creaking to life like a sleeping giant. Power flowed through circuits designed by engineers now long dead. In an orbit around Valaxis 4, a flower of solar panels slowly unfurled. The Dragons sang as they worked, their harmony somehow stabilizing the chaotic feedback loops that threatened to crash the entire system. One by one, the satellites awakened. Energy patterns shifted, carefully redirected by programs the dragons had written in languages that bridged the gap between silicon and song. The effect was not immediate, would not be visible for days or weeks, but the mathematics were inexorable. The deadly spiral of cold would slow, then stop, then reverse. As the final satellite came online, as the network achieved the critical mass needed for stability, something unexpected happened. The dragon's crystals flared with brilliant light, and Grant felt that strange touch against his mind again. But this time, instead of pulling back, he let it flow through him. Images cascaded through his consciousness, not just from the dragons before him, but from others of their kind scattered across the system. He saw makeshift shelters carved from ice, families huddled together for warmth, children too young to understand why the sky had grown dark. He felt their desperation, their fading hope, and then, like dawn breaking, their joy as sensors detected the first subtle changes in temperature. Through the connection, Grant felt their gratitude, not as an abstract concept, but as a living thing. Generations yet unborn would live, because of this moment, would grow up under skies that held warmth as well as beauty. The dragons shared their most sacred gift, the thing that defined them as surely as tool used to find humanity. They shared their memories. He saw their history unfold in fragments and glimpses. A species that had evolved not through competition but through cooperation, that had developed intelligence not to dominate but to harmonize. They had never known war as humans understood it, had never needed to develop the ruthless calculus of military necessity. Their first encounter with humanity had been through intercepted broadcasts, mathematical proofs, and symphonies beamed into space by a species they had thought kindred spirits. The connection faded, leaving Grant gasping and changed. He understood now why they had sought him specifically, why they had risked everything on the conscience of a single human. They had read his story in the networks, had understood that he was a man drowning in guilt, searching for redemption. They had offered him not just the chance to save lives, but to balance the scales of his own conscience. The largest dragon approached, movements slow and careful despite its size. From its pouch, it withdrew another crystal, this one smaller than the others, more intricate in its design. The device pulsed with soft light as the dragon placed it in Grant's hands. Through the fading connection, he understood its purpose. A translator, a bridge between species that would allow true communication. But more than that, it was an invitation. The dragons were offering him a place among them, a chance to be the first human to truly know their kind. "You want me to come with you," Grant said, the words feeling both impossible and inevitable. "To leave this place, to help you find a new home." The dragon's response needed no translation. Its eyes held understanding and offer in equal measure. They were not asking him to abandon his kind, but to become a bridge between worlds. Someone who could speak for them to humanity, who could ensure that the fear and misunderstanding that had led to so many conflicts might be avoided. Grant looked around the station that had been his prison and his penance for 15 years. The walls that had contained his guilt, the systems he had maintained as a form of meditation, the isolation that had slowly been killing him. None of it held any power over him now. "I'll need time to prepare," he said, already mentally cataloging what he would need for the journey. "To secure the station, to send messages that will explain what happened here." The dragons withdrew, giving him space and privacy. As Grant began his preparations, he felt something he had thought lost forever. Purpose. Not the cold purpose of military duty, but something warmer, more fundamental. The knowledge that his life, marked by tragedy and mistake, still had meaning to give. He drafted messages to Alliance Command, to the scientific community, to anyone who would listen. He included the dragons' data, their projections, the proof that the climate intervention was working. He knew many would condemn his actions, would see only treaty violations and unauthorized contact. But others would understand, would see the necessity that transcended law. As the storm outside began to abate, as the first subtle warmth touched Valax's frozen surface, Grant sealed the station for the last time. The dragons waited outside, their injuries healing, their strength returning. They had prepared a shelter for him, a craft that would protect his fragile human form as they journeyed to their hidden colonies. Standing at the threshold, Grant took one last look at the place that had been his self-imposed tomb. The medals still lay in their drawer. The commendations still hung reversed on the wall, but they no longer held any power over him. The past was immutable, carved in stone and sorrow. But the future, he now understood, was still being written. He stepped outside, into air that already felt fractionally warmer, and allowed the dragons to guide him to his new life. Above, the satellites continued their delicate dance, reshaping the very sky with mathematics and desperate hope. It was a small change, a tiny adjustment in the vast machinery of the cosmos. But it was enough. As they traveled across Valaxis IV's transforming landscape, Grant marveled at the dragons' adaptation to their harsh surroundings. Their temporary settlements were architectural wonders, structures that worked with the ice rather than against it. He saw how they had survived, through cooperation and innovation, through refusal to surrender to inevitable doom. At their primary colony, a city carved into the heart of a glacier, Grant met others of their kind. The variety among them was staggering, scales that ranged from midnight black to brilliant silver, sizes from creatures no larger than a human child to elders that dwarfed buildings. They welcomed him with song, with gifts of art that captured light in impossible ways, with a generosity that spoke of a culture untouched by scarcity or fear. The blue-scale dragon, who Grant had come to think of as the scientist of the group, became his primary guide. Through the crystal translator, they shared knowledge in both directions. Grant learned their true name for themselves, a sonic pattern that meant roughly those who sing with the stars. They learned human history, filtered through Grant's military perspective, but softened by his hard-won wisdom. Days became weeks as Grant integrated into their community. He helped refine the satellite control systems, ensuring the climate adjustments remained stable. He documented their culture, preparing reports that would reshape humanity's understanding of intelligence in the universe. But most importantly, he learned to see himself through their eyes. To the dragons, his past was not a source of shame, but a part of his story, a wound that had shaped him into someone capable of great empathy. They had a ceremony for such things, a ritual they called the Harmony of Scars. Through song and shared memory, they acknowledged that all beings carried damage, and that healing came not from forgetting, but from integration. The night they performed the ceremony for Grant, the entire colony gathered. The dragons sang his story back to him, the massacre at Kepler, 7 rendered not as a moment of failure, but as a turning point in a larger narrative. They sang of his exile, his years of contemplation, his choice to help them despite the cost. In their harmony, his life became not a tragedy, but an epic, a journey from darkness to light. Grant wept for the first time in 15 years, not from sorrow, but from release. The guilt that had defined him, imprisoned him, began to transform into something else. Not absolution, for the dead remained dead, but understanding. He had been a soldier asked to make impossible choices with imperfect information. He had failed, had owned that failure, and had found a way to prevent others from bearing the same burden. As the climate stabilized, as warmth returned to Valaxis IV and the other colonies throughout the system, the dragons began to plan for the future. They spoke of formal contact with humanity, of alliances based on mutual benefit rather than fear. They asked Grant to be their ambassador, their voice in the councils of the alliance. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had fled from humanity would now speak for an alien race. The soldier who had caused death would advocate for life. But perhaps that was exactly why he was the right choice. He knew the cost of misunderstanding, the price of fear-based decisions. He could bridge not just species, but perspectives. The day the first Alliance ship arrived in response to his messages, Grant stood with the Dragon Elders on a plateau overlooking their city. The vessel descended slowly, its crew clearly nervous about the unauthorized first contact. Through the communicator, Grant heard familiar protocols, military voices following procedures he had once enforced. "This is Commander Sarah Chun of the Alliance Vessel Harmony," the voice crackled. We are responding to communications regarding treaty violations and unauthorized activation of the Halcyon network. Identify yourself. Grant smiled at the formality, at the barely controlled tension in the commander's voice. Commander Chun, this is former Commander Grant Sorrell. I confirm unauthorized activation of climate control systems to prevent extinction-level events. I am prepared to face charges, but first, I would like to introduce you to some people you need to meet. The Dragons had prepared for this moment, had crafted a first contact protocol that drew from both their culture and humanities. As the Alliance team disembarked, weapons lowered but ready, the Dragons sang a greeting that their translators rendered into perfect Terran standard. They offered gifts of art and knowledge, demonstrations of their science that left the human scientists speechless. Grant watched the fear drain from the visitors' faces, replaced by wonder and curiosity. Commander Chun, a young officer with intelligent eyes, approached him during a break in the formal ceremonies. The reports we received didn't do this justice, she said quietly. High Command is in chaos. Half want you arrested, half want you decorated. What do you want? Grant asked. She looked at the Dragons, at their city of ice and light, at the evidence of a civilization that had achieved spaceflight through cooperation rather than competition. I want to learn, she said. I want to understand how we move forward from here. That night, as human and dragon representatives shared their first formal meal, Grant found himself translating not just languages but worldviews. He explained human fears, born from centuries of conflict and competition. He conveyed dragon confusion at the concept of deliberate violence, their struggle to understand how intelligence could evolve alongside aggression. The talks continued for days, then weeks. Treaties were proposed, modified, discarded, and rewritten. The Dragons offered their climate science, their understanding of stellar mechanics, their artistic traditions. Humanity offered industrial capacity, military protection, and access to the vast network of colonized worlds. Through it all, Grant served as more than a translator. He was a living example of how two species could not just coexist, but thrive together. His very presence, a human fully accepted into dragon society, spoke louder than any diplomatic protocol. The day the formal alliance was signed, Grant stood between the two delegations as they exchanged documents that would reshape galactic politics. The Dragons sang their approval, a harmony that made the crystal architecture of their city resonate in sympathy. The humans, led by Commander Chun, responded with their own celebration, music from Earth that echoed strangely beautiful in the alien acoustics. That evening, Grant found himself alone on the observation platform, where he had first truly understood the dragon's plight. The largest dragon, the one who had first approached his station, joined him in comfortable silence. Through the translator, emotions flowed as easily as words. "You saved us," the dragon said simply. Grant shook his head. "You saved me first. I came to that moon to die slowly, to punish myself for failures I couldn't undo. You gave me a reason to live, a chance to choose life over death." The dragon's response was a feeling more than words, a concept their language expressed in harmonies human throats could never reproduce. It spoke of circles completing, of wounds becoming wisdom, of the strange paths by which the universe achieved balance. Above them, the Halcyon satellites continued their work, invisible guardians against the cold that had once threatened everything. Their activation had violated treaties, had shattered 50 years of legal precedent. It had also saved an entire species and forged an alliance that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Grant thought of the civilians on Kepler 7, wondered if their sacrifice had somehow led to this moment. Not as justification, never that, but as part of a larger pattern he was only beginning to understand. Every choice rippled outward. Every action had consequences beyond imagination. His greatest failure had led to his deepest isolation, which had positioned him perfectly to achieve this redemption. "What happens now?" Grant asked. The dragon gestured to the city below, where humans and dragons worked side by side, learning each other's science and art. "Now we build." Not just cities or alliances, but understanding. We teach the universe that different doesn't mean dangerous, that cooperation achieves more than competition. Grant nodded, feeling the truth of it in his bones. He had spent his life as a soldier, trained to see threats and neutralize them. Now he would spend whatever years remained as a bridge builder, helping two species learn to sing in harmony. As the stars emerged overhead, as the aurora danced in skies no longer deadly cold, Grant allowed himself a moment of peace. The guilt would never fully leave him. The memories of Kepler, 7 would always carry their weight. But alongside them now were other memories. Dragons singing in the storm, crystal cities rising from ice, the moment two species chose trust over fear. He thought of the station on Valaxis, 4, empty now but still maintained by his automated systems. Sometimes he considered returning, just to visit, to remind himself of the man he had been. But that man was gone, transformed by encounter and choice into something new. The dragon beside him began to sing, a melody Grant had learned meant gratitude beyond words. He found himself humming along, his human voice adding its own texture to the alien harmony. Together, they watched the stars wheel overhead, each one a sun that might warm worlds where other beings struggled and hoped and reached across the void for understanding. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer empty. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, moments when fear threatened to overwhelm wisdom. But there would also be this, two species that had found each other in the cold dark, that had chosen cooperation over isolation, that had proven even the deepest guilt could be transformed into purpose. Grant smiled, feeling the dragon's presence beside him like warmth against the lingering chill. He had come to Valaxis, for to disappear, to fade from a universe he no longer felt he deserved to inhabit. Instead, he had found a reason to remain, a role that used all his skills and all his scars in service of something greater than redemption. As the aurora painted the sky in colors that sang of hope, Grant knew his war was finally over. Not the external conflicts that had defined his military career, but the internal battle that had driven him into exile. He was no longer Commander Sorrel, hero or villain, depending on who told the story. He was simply Grant, friend to dragons, builder of bridges between worlds. The dragon's song shifted, taking on notes of future-making and possibility. Through their connection, Grant saw visions of what might come. Cities where human and dragon architecture merged into something unprecedented, ships crewed by both species exploring the galaxy together, children who would grow up seeing difference as opportunity rather than threat. It was a future worth building, worth the price of broken treaties and shattered precedents. A future where the cold equations of military necessity gave way to the warmer mathematics of mutual survival. A future where even the most profound guilt could be transformed into wisdom, where the greatest failures could become the foundation for the most important successes. Grant added his voice to the dragon's song, and together they sang the sun to rest on a world no longer dying, in a universe suddenly filled with infinite possibility. Years would pass before the full impact of that night on Valaxis became clear. History books would debate the ethics of Grant's choice. Military academies would study the precedent of necessary treaty violations, and philosophers would argue whether one man's redemption justified risking interstellar war. But for those who were there, who saw two species reach across the void of understanding to save each other, the answer was simpler. Sometimes the universe places individuals at pivot points where all their failures and successes converge into a single moment of choice. Grant Sorrel, soldier in exile, had been such an individual. His choice had saved not just the dragons, but humanity itself from the slow death of isolation and fear. The dragons would keep their promise, becoming ambassadors of a different way of thinking, teachers of cooperation over competition. They would share technologies that made human expansion gentler on the worlds they touched, philosophies that enriched human art and science. In return, Humanity would provide the industrial might and organizational skills to help the dragons not just survive but thrive in their new homes. And at the center of it all stood Grant, no longer seeking redemption, but having found something better, purpose that transformed past failures into future wisdom. He would live among the dragons for the rest of his days, serving as translator and bridge, helping two species learn to sing with one voice. On cold nights, when the aurora danced across skies no longer deadly, he would think of that station on Valaxis, for of the man who had arrived there seeking death and the dragons who had offered him life instead. He would remember the weight of choice, the courage required to break laws in service of higher justice, and the strange paths by which the universe achieves balance. The story of the frozen alien dragons who begged a human veteran for shelter would become legend, told differently by each species, but always ending the same way, with two races choosing trust over fear, cooperation over conflict, and proving that even in the coldest void, warmth could be found in the most unexpected places. Grant Sorrell had sought exile and found family. He had carried guilt and discovered purpose. He had thought his story ended in failure and learned it was only beginning. In saving the dragons, he had saved himself. In helping them find a new home, he had finally come home himself. The universe, vast and cold and infinite, suddenly seemed a little warmer, a little more filled with possibility. All because on one frozen night, against all probability and protocol, a soldier in exile had chosen to open his door to strangers in need. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin not with bold steps into the unknown, but with the simple act of saying yes when the universe knocks on your door and asks for help. Grant Sorrell had said yes, and in doing so had changed the course of history for two species and countless individuals yet unborn. The dragons sang of it in harmonies that made the stars themselves seem to dance. Humans wrote of it in words that could never quite capture the full truth. But all agreed on one thing. When the cold threatened to consume everything, warmth had prevailed. When isolation seemed the only answer, connection had triumphed. When the past seemed to define the future, choice had proven more powerful than fate. In the end, that was Grant Sorrell's true legacy. Not the battles he had won or lost, not the lives he had taken or saved, but the simple proof that redemption was always possible, that bridges could be built across any divide, and that sometimes the universe's greatest gifts come disguised as its greatest challenges. The frozen alien dragons had sought shelter and found a friend. Grant Sorrell had sought death and found a reason to live. Two species had faced extinction and found each other. In the vast cold of space, they had created warmth that would echo through generations, proof that even in the darkest void, hope could take root and flourish. As the years passed and the alliance between humans and dragons grew stronger, Grant's story became a touchstone for both species. To the dragons, he was the human who had chosen compassion over law, who had risked everything to save strangers. To humans, he was proof that even the deepest guilt could be transformed into purpose, that redemption was not a destination, but a journey. He continued to serve as a bridge between worlds until his final days, teaching each species to see through the other's eyes. When he finally passed, peacefully, and surrounded by friends of both species, the dragons sang a lament that lasted 3 days, while humans observed a moment of silence that spanned the entire alliance. They've buried him on Valaxis 4, inside of the station where it had all begun. The monument they erected bore inscriptions in both human languages and dragon song script. But the epitaph, suggested by the eldest dragon and approved by unanimous human consent, was simplest of all. Here lies Grant Sorrell, who opened the door. In those 5 words lay a universe of meaning. The door to his station. The door to possibility. The door between species. The door from guilt to redemption. The door from isolation to community. The door from fear to trust. In the years that followed, as humans and dragons explored the galaxy together, as their alliance grew into true partnership and even friendship, they would remember the lesson of that door. That sometimes the bravest act is not to fight, but to welcome. that sometimes the greatest victory is not over others, but over our own fear and isolation. Grant Sorrell had opened the door, and through it had walked not just three desperate dragons, but the entire future of two species learning to thrive together. In the end, that was his answer to the guilt that had driven him into exile. Not to undo the past, but to build a better future. The dragons still sing of him when the aurora dances. Humans still tell his story when they need to remember that redemption is possible. And on Valaxis 4, the station still stands, maintained now as a monument to the moment when one man's choice to help strangers in need changed the course of galactic history. The door remains open, a symbol and a promise. A reminder that in the vast cold of space, warmth can be found in the most unexpected places. That even in our darkest moments, we can choose light. That when we open ourselves to others, we often find not what we feared, but what we most deeply needed. Grant Sorrell sought isolation and found community. He carried guilt and discovered purpose. He thought his story was over and learned it had barely begun. In the end, he proved that sometimes the universe's greatest gifts come not when we're looking for them, but when we simply choose to open the door.